Thank you all for joining us for the first leaf surgery of 2026. It seems like it's come incredibly quickly. I hope you all had a good end to 2025. We've got some good surgery subjects coming up this year, so it'd be great to have you join us for those. Keep an eye out on the mailing list and e-brief for our next subject. Today's subject is one very close to our heart here at Leaf. It's following on from a project, UKRI-funded project that Leaf are one of the partners on, the NCS project, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome two of the other partners from that project, John MacArthur, Managing Director of MacArthur BDC, and Brian Kenyon, the Senior Poultry Nutritionist at ABN, to join us, even just in the sort of pre-meeting and the sort of build-up to today's surgery, chatting through just the complexities and the nuance of the subjects we've got, then I think we're going to have some really good discussion. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat. A colleague of mine, Emily, is going to help field those. We'll put as many as we can to Brian and John, and we aim to finish promptly at 10:45. So I can't do either of these speakers justice in terms of my introduction, so I'm going to hand over to them both to do a little bit more of a detailed introduction on their role, their background, and importantly, their role within the NCS project. Brian, I'm going to start with you, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Brian Kenyon. I'm the Senior Poultry Nutritionist at ABN. For those that don't know who ABN are, we are an independent monogastric feed manufacturer. We have operations or mills across the UK, making both pig and poultry feed. From my personal point of view, I've been involved in poultry nutrition now for too many years. Over 30 years I've been involved in the industry, and I've seen the industry evolve, very much evolve from different mix of raw materials when I first joined or graduated and joined the industry to where we are today, which is on the poultry side, very much a cereal soya based diet makeup. And it's been really interesting to see how we've got here. From that perspective and how things are changing, the ABN were very keen on getting involved to see how we can develop alternative ways or remove our reliance on soya and utilize more of the UK's arable operations, being that intermediary between our customer or the end user, which in most cases is the retailer, and a key buyer of UK produced materials. It was important to us to be involved. And you could argue that we've spent the last 30 years learning how to use soya really well. And there has been 30 years of research on how to put that into poultry and pig and other animal production systems. Unfortunately, that research hasn't also been following on in other pulses. So they're a bit behind. So at the moment, we need to fast track that knowledge build. And that's really where ABN were very keen on being involved in this project.
Thank you, Brian. And it's really clear how well placed you are in the industry to be able to sort of filter things through from both ends there. John, over to you in terms of intro and your involvement in the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. My name's John MacArthur. I'm the Managing Director of MacArthur BDC. And we are a business that specializes in the design, build and maintenance of grain drying, storage and processing systems for farms and also for commercial processors as well. How we came to the NCS project was actually through one of our manufacturing partnerships, looking at pulse processing systems which could be used on farm, and that led us to being part of the NCS project, where I lead the work package looking at how we can add value to pulses post-harvest to increase their soy replacement potential in different livestock sectors. So we worked with Brian very closely at ABN on the commercial poultry trials alongside the research poultry trials that have been done at SRUC by Jos Houdijk. And we've also done work on the dairy sector and beef as well. Out of this project and the research and the work that we've done and the processing improvements that we've worked on, we've established a new business, which is a spin out from MacArthur BDC called BritPulse, which is going to specialize in the production of low emission feed ingredients.
Thank you, John. You've both done a much better job than I ever would have done in terms of credentials and background, and why I think we're really lucky to have you both here to explore what is an interesting but quite complicated subject. On that front, I think a good place to start is incorporation of beans into rotation and the promotion of that practice. It's not a new thing. We've been talking about it in the industry for a long time, and to varying degrees of success. But why do we think that the framing this time around is different? Why do we think the NCS project, the work coming out of it, is actually well placed to bring about a change in what we're doing and really kickstart this replacement of soya and the other benefits? John, I'm going to go straight back to you for your opinion on that, if I may.
So I suppose where I would like to start with this is with our engagement with retailers and food service businesses around the project. What's really changed is the pull and the demand. Now, the demand at the moment isn't for homegrown pulses, but the increasing demand is for reduction in emissions. But particularly a lot of businesses looking at their scope 3 commitments where they've got 20, 30% reductions in scope 3 looming now. And there's still a lot of ground to be covered to achieve those. So I think really what's happening is we're seeing retailers really engaging with meeting these commitments, looking into their supply chains and seeing where these emissions reductions can be achieved. And if we looked at the at Brian's sector, the poultry sector, the overwhelming majority of emissions are generated from the feed, of which the soybean meal is a significant contributor to that. And so I think it's the framing around the beans that have changed. It isn't the beans themselves. And as we know, it's almost an issue that the yield and the reliability of the crop hasn't really moved very far in 20 or 30 years. While we've been, as Brian said and summed up very nicely, we've been very focused on understanding how to use this imported protein and the soybean meal instead.
Thanks, John. So we're certainly seeing a change there in some of the push factors, aren't we, and actually in the supply chain. And I think we're going to explore a little bit later how farmers can really take advantage of that, and also where the relationships come into it that I know you guys work with as we do as well. Brian, I know you have some views on why the sort of environment around increasing bean production looks different this time around.
Yeah, it's beans. It's not. We don't just use soya and cereals. We do include today, in most poultry diets, some pulses. The challenge has always been how do we increase those pulses? That's the first part of it. But I think where John sort of mentioned about the end user, I would say the retailer, is really very much focused today on the commitments they've done to reduce their emissions values. And they are very much looking at how do we reduce the emissions values of a kilo of product on their shelves. And the key one at the moment is always very much soya facing. That is the immediate one. That's the big number. And some of the people on the call may be aware of pending legislation of the EUDR coming through, which should have been enforced 2024 and has been slowly kicked down the chain, and he's definitely coming in 2027, so they say, but we'll have clarity. But that will impact very much on the availability and the supply of soya. And if we address that and we start looking at low carbon soyas just to replace like for like, it will have an impact on the carbon cost of the feed. But the other big, well, once you've addressed that, the other then big real contributor to your diet is coming from the cereals. And the cereals that we use within our diets today are 99% UK produced. So how are we going to influence that carbon value of that wheat, barley that's being used? We then have to look at how we adapt or generate a interest or a value in low carbon wheats. And that's the other side that I see. We're increasing the use of pulses or pulses, beans, peas, whichever we say, actually has a real bigger impact for the UK farmer. So in essence, we've got to create a greater demand value of the beans, pulses, to stimulate that growth in lower carbon cereals.
Yeah, really good point. Just to clarify, EUDR, EU deforestation regulation, is that correct? And then I think what you've really explain there, Brian, is actually where some of the pull factors might come for the farmers as well. So I think sometimes maybe the producers and growers can feel that things are put on them from further up the supply chain in terms of scope 3 emissions, regulation, and actually it's about what advantages and what control the growers themselves can have. And what you've explored there is the impacts on the following cereal crop, which I think is really, really important as a pull factor. John, I know you and I have talked about sort of how the cost of production of beans actually and the reward farmers will get for that can really be something that holds people back in terms of growing more. And maybe how that can feed into what Brian's talked about there about the follow-on benefits and how we can perhaps look at changing the market to mean that there is even more pull factor for farmers to introduce beans into rotations.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking before, weren't we? On a purely economic basis at the moment, it's quite difficult to recommend to anyone on the call here today to plant a lot of beans this spring. And because the reality is, with the prices as they are, they're around about at or below cost of production. And while you've got at or below cost of production, you're going to have intermittent and uncertain supply, which makes it very difficult for the downstream supply chain and to really engage with homegrown pulses. And that's been the kind of the area that I think beans have been stuck in for quite some time. It's going to be about if homegrown pulses and homegrown proteins have a role to play in reducing emissions and helping retailers meet their emissions commitment. And actually, really, we should be looking at more the broader ecosystem services that beans deliver. So you're looking at also supporting biodiversity, protecting water quality, and this broader set of environmental benefits that are associated with them. We're going to have to return value to the producer of those beans to ensure that we have a reliable supply that we can actually plan and use in the livestock feed system in the future. And it's that mechanism for returning that value down the supply chain. If that does not happen, this isn't a solution to be used, but it's one that we really, really need. We've talked narrowly about emissions, but we've also got a question of security here and the resilience of our food system. With our livestock sector so dependent on the imported soy, we really have very little in the way of plan B if the world was to radically change. And you've only got to spend 30 minutes listening to somebody like Professor Tim Lang to think actually we are in a world where the security and the resilience of our food system is probably taken for granted, and actually homegrown proteins and a policy around that really does have a place in a more resilient food system.
And so how can we try and shore up some of those supply chains? Because you're exactly right. There's multiple ways in which it can fall over. And for example, looking at a position where we look to replace soy in those diets, and then we don't have a reliable supply, we don't have a reliable UK supply, there's a risk there. It would be good to talk a bit more about that, and then also how we can actually ensure that, as well as the research that's going on farm about the benefits of beans, that we can shore up that supply so we have something that can stand the test of time. I'm going to head straight back to you, John, I think, while you're in the chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we know that the right price signal will stimulate production of beans, and so we need to pay. Beans need to be at a price where a farm can plant them. How we create that value is an interesting question, and it's how we evidence that value as well. At the moment, your value of beans is based off really the energy and protein content and a comparison to soy. But what that completely omits is the emissions difference between those two protein sources. And if we're actually able to return some of the value of that substitution to the grower, then you'll really change that. And we've only to look at the impact of protein aid in Ireland, where there's a subsidy that's been provided to stimulate production of protein, to see that if the return for the farm improves on producing those beans, you will jump huge acreages very quickly and supply will respond. But it's creating that pull, and it's the supply chain needing to have the wherewithal and the will to actually create and embrace that change.
So as ever, the agricultural industry is very adaptable if the conditions are right for that to happen. Brian, from the perspective of a company involved in the sort of purchasing and use of those beans, what can be done at your end and businesses like yours to ensure that the demand and the reward is there?
I think what John really did touch on is currently pulses are traded on protein and energy. And it's how we get everybody, whether we've got to change how all crops are truly evaluated or valued based on what do they actually bring to that end product. So don't just say protein. As a poultry nutritionist, we do not formulate to protein, but everything's sold on protein. We actually formulate to the building blocks of that protein. And for us, that's more important. And we look at that. And one of the challenges we have initially when just looking at beans is things like the variability of those beans and that content of those amino acids. So one of my call outs through this project has always been to the plant breeders to say, we need to improve field beans. That's one key thing. And once from a nutrition point of view, we maximize the nutritional value, we then have to start really looking at what value does beans bring to the end product and getting, as John has said, that value brought back properly all the way down to the producer. So looking at how does it improve from the carbon point of view, how does it really improve the wheat, the cereals that follow, and the overall impact. You can't do one without the other. And that's the bit that I've been trying to champion all the way up. We can do a very quick, we can reduce your soya, tick. I can reduce the carbon value of that soya. I'll just bring it in from the US. And please do not ask me the question about when does land use change become significant, because I think that is one of the issues I have with the whole carbon valuing and green side of this, is somebody has stipulated things like if the land was deforested or changed 20 years ago, it doesn't count today, which doesn't put a full value then on land that has potentially been agricultural land for 150 years. There's no point of difference. So I struggle sometimes with that. And it's almost like shouting about the fact we're going to be growing beans not on new land. This is established arable land, and it is going to improve that land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? And you're exactly right. So one, in terms of the changes that are required across the supply chain and the industry, that they're involved, aren't they? There's lots of changes necessary, not least the value of those crops. But then also you've touched on why the environment is different today than it has been in the past. And actually how we need to understand more about the benefits and more about the nuance to be able to tell that story really thoroughly. And that sort of brings me on to who needs to be involved in these discussions. We've touched on it a bit, both of you have touched on it in terms of across the supply chain, but it seems like even with the breadth of partners involved in the NCS project, that actually we still need to be bringing other people into some of those discussions to bring about that wholesale change that we've just touched on there. That's to you.
I fully agree. I think the supply industry, up until delivering the feed to the chicken or the pig or the cow, understand what needs to be done. It's getting those end users on board and truly understand and committed, and to make them actually say we're on a journey. You're not on a short-term change. I was sat there trying to think to myself of an analogy. It's almost like saying we want everybody to have an electric car, but we're not. We want them tomorrow, but we all know the infrastructure is not there today to do that. So you can't have that. We have to have that commitment. If you want us to significantly impact the carbon value of UK produced meat to put onto your shelves, which will impact your overall carbon number, you need to commit. And that isn't 12 months, that isn't 2 years, that's a 5-10 year plan, because nobody on this call is looking at tomorrow. They're looking further forward, and that's what we've got to all agree to. And it's getting that commitment and everybody in that supply chain to agree we're moving in that direction.
So these are long-term relationships, long-term partnerships, aren't they?
Yeah. And I'm hoping there's nobody on here from a legal or from a government point of view, but as far as I'm concerned, government are only interested in 4 years. We can't operate in that. We have to operate outside on a longer period. None of the supply chain, none of the industry can cope just on a 4-year period.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that whenever we're having discussions around the sort of transition farming and food production needs to go on, those long-term decision-making, long-term policy goals and long-term relationships come up all the time. And we do see some signals of that, particularly from the retail sector, although possibly not from policy. John, I just wanted to ask you about how farmers can perhaps take advantage of this change that we've talked about, and also what they can do immediately or very quickly to put themselves in a position to be able to take advantage of that.
I like Brian said, this is a systemic issue, and it's going to need to be moved over long time horizons, and it needs the entire supply chain to engage with that. But what I found quite interesting is when you work with when it's gone off the farm and beyond the kind of the production of whichever livestock product it might be, but all of a sudden becomes a fairly limited understanding of what can actually be done and be achieved. And so in my conversations with retailers, it's been quite apparent that there's no link in their mind or in their understanding between the commitments to reducing deforestation in their business that they face, their emissions commitments, their wanting to engage with regenerative agriculture in the UK. There's no kind of thread that starts to join all these things together, and reducing the environmental impact, and also being prepared for a changing food system longer term into the future, which might see a concentration on more pulses in human consumption and maybe a reduced dependence on animal-based protein might be as part of a better, more sustainable food system. It's actually growing some of our protein in the UK, processing it here to produce the best possible feed ingredient that we can from it, and incorporation of that into our existing livestock feeds is something that I can actually touch all of these areas. And actually what I would say is, like, go out and plant the spring beans, absolutely. And hopefully Brian will give you a little bit more from them come October than he would be right now. But it's about engaging with your customers. So if you're in a dairy farm, if you're in a poultry supply chain, in a pig supply chain, speak to a customer about emissions reductions. Significant emissions reductions can be delivered with a change in feed. The cost of that is actually, in many cases, less than the cost of offsetting that ton of carbon. And actually, if your customers don't start engaging with the carbon insetting opportunities within their supply chains, as farmers who are producing beans at below the cost of production, selling offsets then becomes the alternative way to make things stack up. And that eliminates the opportunity for the supply chain to reduce the emissions within its supply chain. And we've come back to emissions there again, because really it's such a useful and quite broadly understood lever to create a kind of a broadly better environmental outcomes. But the emissions is a language that is understood more widely.
Yeah, I think you have brought together lots of things there. So I completely agree with that thread. Incorporating more pulses delivers on so many levels to so many people. It's an opportunity not to be missed, but it's about how we communicate that. And it was interesting to hear your sort of views on producers, farmers, and growers discussing that with their customer base as well, and actually delivering that, because if we don't, you're right, we're going to then, there'll be lost opportunities there, and actually we'll be going about it in a more expensive way that delivers on less levels. I think actually organisations like Leaf have a role to play in that, a role in showcasing the benefits of these things and speaking to multiple people throughout that supply chain. So there's a lot to be talked about on that front. Definitely. Interestingly, what do you think are the big sort of changes or investments in infrastructure that we would need to really facilitate that transition away from soya? I know, John, that you would do a lot of this work in your day-to-day job.
Yeah, absolutely. And we initially approached the post-harvest processing from a point of view of how can we support farms to be more vertically integrated between their arable operations and their livestock operations, particularly thinking in laying hens and also the dairy sectors, which are less integrated. But I think the reality is that the change is really going to come about is going to be a smaller number of larger centralized processing systems can actually, it's relatively simple. The technology isn't incredibly sophisticated. And it's like so much of this is the stuff that would typically be risky in many other kind of like innovative markets. It's the technology that's the risk. This isn't the risk. The risk is how do we change people's understanding and how they value the commodities that are available for livestock feed. So really, you'd be looking at a small number of large processing facilities to be able to serve customers like ABN and other large-scale mills, and also that growing group as well, and there's farmers, and there isn't none of that exists really in pulses on a large enough scale, whereas in cereals it does.
So it's some of that investment there is in processing, but as we've touched on repeatedly, it's having that confidence in the market, and it's a bit chicken and egg, a bit like Brian's EV and charging analogy, that those two things are sort of required to support each other, but it's who leaps first, and actually we want everyone to go together, so that's supported there. Just going back to the animal nutrition side of things. So this is a question for you, Brian, and I appreciate that poultry nutrition is your area of expertise, but is ruminants perhaps more or less challenging than the monogastric market?
I was going to say, in the current project, pig, for example, has not been included, and that's because it was already proven 10 years ago in a project called Green Pig that beans can replace soya. But unfortunately, the project was done part and just put on the shelf, and it wasn't really actioned. That was one of the key things we when we participated in this project, was it was not just going to be a project that said, oh, we can just replace soya. The key thing for this is a sustainable outcome of continued use of pulses. And you then start thinking, well, would it work better in ruminant? And the ruminant people involved in this project are showing real benefit of utilising not just the crop of beans as a pulse, but also from a whole crop perspective, and how it can be part of that full diet for the ruminant. And that is really being shown as a real positive. I just want to touch on some of the comments John said about having to sort of have that additional processing of the bean to create better value, better nutritional value, particularly if it's going to go into a monogastric diet. And I think the key things there is we trade a whole bean, and that is being routinely compared with a soya bean meal. And that meal has had some of the factors, the naturally occurring factors within it, removed. So it should not be unexpected that you have to add a level of processing to remove some of those natural factors which the bean puts there to help it potentially germinate. You know, it didn't intend for us to actually sit there and eat it. It doesn't want us to do that. So it has factors within it to disrupt that. So everything from the hard shell, the fiber part of it, to naturally occurring chemicals which are within that material, which disrupt digestion. And through what you could argue is quite relatively simple processes, you can actually remove a lot of that and significantly improve the value, the nutritional value of that bean. But as John has said, it just takes that investment. Somebody has to put the investment in to do it. And you then have to say, we've put the investment in, what's the return, what's the commitment? And you need somebody to be thinking not 12 months, not 2 years. You've got to be looking 4 or 5 years, which is no different than the supply chain. The arable farm is not looking at 12 months. He's looking longer term. So it comes back to that commitment through the supply chain of how and that is then needed to give confidence to do this investment.
So longer term relationships again, and then the importance of sort of comparing apples with apples, really, in terms of that nutritional assessment. And as we touched on before, it's looking beyond the simplistic sort of protein assessment, and actually the much wider benefits in the rotation as well.
Dan, if I could just quickly add to that as well, and it's such a key point that Brian raised there about it's making use of all the fractions as well from that process, and that is happening, and there is investment and supports coming from government for that. We're involved in a piece of research which is only just got underway, which is specifically looking at how we can use the co-products from the decortication process, which adds the value for poultry, how we can use those co-products because they actually have anti-methogenic properties. And so how can they be used in the dairy sector as a feed additive and naturally to create a naturally occurring methane inhibitor. And there's a very large project that's just about to get underway studying that. And this is about maximizing the total value of that bean. And then that drives then when we prove that value, we need to give the right price signal to our farmers to put them in the ground in sufficient quantity so we can use them.
Brilliant. So again, multiple benefits and a sort of altered environment framing that we've had in the past, but it's really capitalising on those opportunities across that whole supply chain. Brilliant. We've had a few questions from people in the audience. One is talking around the organic sector. So because there is, a slight price premium for organically produced beans, is there ways we can leverage that more, really bring in the organic sector? Because do we think there is a market for those organic beans, particularly in animal feed, that would actually help to take advantage of that price premium and drive more uptake in the organic sector?
The organic sector, I would say, their use is relatively small. If we want to have a bigger impact on the UK emissions value, we really need to be really targeting that mainstream production. The organic sector will grow, but it'll be small. It will not be a big one that could really give the farmers a real opportunity to increase their acreage of pulses.
And just to build on what Brian says there, I think that though there is a real opportunity here for organic to be the early adopters with these kind of changes, particularly in terms of organic dairy and the pressures surrounding the imported soy that's going in, organic imported soy. I think actually the replacement economics is better than in a conventional system. So there's definitely scope for engagement. Like Brian says, the total market size may be smaller, but I think there are those drivers in that sector that encourage earlier adoption and earlier engagement. And it's that early engagement in that sector which might pave the way for a much broader, wider rollout in the conventional side of the industry as well. And as one dairy farm that's also cheese production, they were very excited about really getting down to the carbon footprint of their product, until they saw the impact of imported soy on the carbon footprint of their finished cheese product. And I think it was a germ to be reconvened once they'd replaced the soy in the ration. And I think a lot of organic businesses, they're quite on they're much more on the forefront of that. So I think they ought to be, there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, so there's a sort of setting of the scene, bringing together an already bit of price advantage and some pressures on that organic sector that produce opportunities that mean actually they could be on the front foot and, as you say, sort of trailblazing for the wider, more conventional industry to follow on.
And just to add, their end user is probably more happier to pay a premium for that product, which is, again, the other big challenge that we have.
Yeah, so it's ensuring actually for our member of the audience who's an organic grower would like to bring beans back into that rotation. It's ensuring that the market exists, although we know that actually there is the footings and the foundations for that to happen. So some of those conversations to facilitate that. And then really another question around some of those conversations. I think you guys have done a brilliant job of really selling the benefits and why the environment looks slightly different presently, and also that we need to have some of those conversations and we need to have facilitation of those changes that are necessary. But in terms of farmers, it's difficult to say, well, do they go out tomorrow and talk to some of their customers? Do they lobby for policy? Is there a role for some of the lobbying organisations to talk about it as well? It's really how we target our efforts to maximum effect if we would start doing this next week.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think that's just building on Henry's question, there's a few levels which is on, and them in the question is you, me, and all of us as consumers. That's where the retailers and food service would really have us believe that the demand lies. And while if we are uninterested and don't base our buying decisions around things like the impact of our livestock products, we'll continue to, Brian will be asked for least cost formulations based on everything that's legal that can be got into the country and put into a chicken, and you'll get to eat the result of that. And so there's definitely, as individual consumers, there's a role to play. But as we know, there isn't kind of true agency. We buy what's put in front of us, and so that's why there is a big role for the retailer to play, and that incentive of achieving those quite ambitious emissions reductions that a lot of them are tied to now. That's a really good lever to start moving things. But I think this solution really has to come from the market, and I think the low hang the kind of the easy option is to say, well, you know what, we need a kind of a protein subsidy like we have in places in Ireland, and like in other places in Europe like Ireland. But we are working with businesses in Ireland who have a glut of beans that don't have end users, and the price has been propped up, but it's tanking the market, and it actually stifles innovation, and it stops people really thinking about what is the right positive systemic change to embrace over that kind of 10, 15, 20-year horizon. And there is a willingness, because our retailers still want to be generating profits in 20 and 30 years' time as well. The alignment of a good and better food system is very much in their interest as much as it is ours. And so it is broad, but we've got a role as consumers. We definitely have the retailers have a role. So if we're working with retailers, it's speaking to them about these opportunities, and those all channels are valuable and meaningful.
And the NCS project and the outcomes will provide more evidence for those conversations, more grounding for those conversations. So there's.
Can I just add to John's comment? The other bit that concerns me is that UK agriculture misses another opportunity.
Mm.
The reason we use so much soya today is because of policy on terms of use of meat and bone meal. And the banning of the use of that in monogastric, all diets, meant that we had to go out there and look for plant-based proteins. And we went out there, and that's what soya filled. There are alternatives out there. There are sunflower out there that could be grown in South America, could be grown in Eastern Europe. But we have an opportunity to fill maybe not all of that gap, but a big chunk of that gap, and bring real value to UK agriculture. And we can sit and discuss today little bits about price and things, but it's the longer term picture. You know, as I started saying, I've been involved in the industry over 30 years. And in that, I have seen soya go from 5% in a diet to over 25% of the diet. And it's now going to be reduced. I don't believe it will disappear out of a broiler diet. I just see it being significantly reduced. And we have a real opportunity, if we get things aligned, to fill that gap.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we've, in our discussions building up to today, we talked about actually this is a great opportunity, but if it isn't filled by UK farmers, it will be filled elsewhere, because the direction of travel of the markets and the supply chain is set. So it's taking advantage of that. And, you know, there's been a lot of common themes. I'm sorry that we haven't managed to get to all the questions that have come up in the chat, but that's because we have, you know, been really sort of getting involved in the nuance, but there's some really good points in there. Some we've touched on. So looking at whether the external carbon markets actually can facilitate some greater incorporation of beans, or whether they might act as a distraction. I think, John, you touched on the fact that if the market doesn't necessarily reward pulses going into rotations, then people will look, as in growers will look elsewhere, and we may see some of those opportunities replaced. And then also we've had some comments on there about actually beans going into the rotation, not for the beans necessarily as a protein supply, but for the benefits those beans have in the rotation, which we've touched on and which we've acknowledged there needs to be some more work in terms of the benefits to the following cereal crop from a nitrogen carbon perspective, but also weeds as well. So I'm going to bring today's session to a close. Thank you to John and thank you to Brian for giving up your time and really helping us explore what is an amazing opportunity and a great subject, and that touches on the NCS project. I know that a lot of the partners are very active on the farming forum. And so if a question perhaps hasn't been answered here, we haven't got to it, then engaging in the farming forum and keeping a look on Pulse PEP for some of the outcomes of the NCS project is really valuable. And also there is still some recruitment for Pulse Pioneers to be involved in trials this coming year. So please keep an eye on that. But finally, thank you very much, John and Brian, for your time, and everybody who's joined. Our next surgery is 13th of February, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.